Hello and welcome to Ahval Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on ahvalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is Tezcan Gümüş, lecturer at the University of Melbourne and analyst of Turkish politics and democracy. Thanks for joining us today, Tez.
It's a pleasure to be here, David. Thank you.
You're welcome. We are talking on Wednesday, November 6th. A Metropole survey out on yesterday, found support for President Erdoğan has surged since Turkey launched its Syria operation last month, with support hitting 48%, his highest total in about 18 months. What do you think of this idea that Turkey's offensive in northeast Syria is in part a political campaign meant to rally the base and encourage nationalist support in the wake of the ruling AKP's defeats in local elections earlier this year?
Well, definitely, I don't think it was something that was conjured up inorganically. It was something that was there outside, obviously beyond Turkey's borders. But I think, the government, or Erdogan's government administration, has definitely taken advantage of that, of the incursion, given the recent local election losses in major cities, especially Istanbul, Ankara, and so forth. The economic downturn, the challenge from ex-AKP members, senior members who are now looking to set up or close to setting up their own parties. So Ali Babacan, Ahmet Davutoğlu, and so forth. So I think this was seen as, it was a very opportunistic move in terms of stopping the electoral slide or reversing the electoral slide and sort of regaining its popularity. And it seems that this rally around the flag strategy has seemed to work instantly for Erdogan's electoral fortunes or popularity amongst the citizens.
Right. To be more specific, the first time the AKP suffered an electoral setback in mid-2015, many blamed it on the Kurdish-led HDP. A month later, the government renewed its conflict with the Kurdish militant group, the PKK, and performed much better in the next vote. In the elections this year, the HDP played a quiet supporting role to the main opposition, CHP, and now amid Turkey's offensive against Syrian Kurdish militia, the HDP has been painted as a terrorist group. Its leaders and key figures have been jailed or detained, and Kurds more broadly in Turkey have been silenced. How does what's happening to Kurds and Kurdish politicians right now, as well as other critical voices in Turkey, how does that compare today to Muslims in Turkey's past?
Definitely, there's when we look at 1990s, a very dark decade for Turkish democracy and very highly unstable politically and economically. There was definitely precedent set on the Çiller's coalition governments, where she basically pretty much gave the Kurdish question, I guess in quotation marks, instead of undertaking a political or democratic strategy to resolve it, she basically gave that up to the military, and it became a completely securitized way of dealing with what was seen as a troublesome issue. So at that point, there was obviously a pro-Kurdish rights party in Parliament at that time, and a number of them were obviously their immunities stripped, and that were given numerous number of jail sentences. So we've seen this pattern before, and also around that same time, I guess people who were critical of the military strategy, the government strategy, were silenced, or there was a number of assassinations of human rights workers, lawyers, and torture was pretty much systematically applied towards anyone that challenged the government's narrative at that time. So this is not something that's unique in Turkey's recent history, but we are seeing it, much more broadly and liberally applied by the government, repressing anyone that is critical in their social media posts, journalists and so forth, and really being labelled as treasonous, treacherous, or unpatriotic. So definitely it has been used to pretty much as a way to silence critics of the government, both in the media and also political opponents as well, being the HDP.
The Syria offensive appears to have achieved its military mission, destroying the YPG entity on Turkey's border with Syria as intended. But yeah, as you suggest, it also appears to have destroyed any prospects for peace between Ankara and the PKK and poisoned relations between the AKP government and Kurds in general, which represent, I think, about 18% of the population. What do you think this means going forward in terms of the Kurdish question, in terms of the government's relations with Kurds, reconciliation, and potential peace with the PKK? Can there be a recovery within a reasonable time frame?
Obviously, I can't tell you about what's going to happen in the future, but we could obviously see what might happen, given the patterns with today, what might happen in the very near future. And I think in terms of resolving any issues with the domestic Kurdish population, arriving at maybe some sort of political solution, I think that's sort of null and void at this point in time, given the HDP were the number one representatives of the Kurdish community in terms of advocating their rights and pushing forward their rights, or more inclusivity in the political process. So when you start, the repression of HDP politicians and so forth goes back to 2016, when we saw that, the co-leaders Selahattin Demirtas and Figen Yüksekdağ and other, 10, 11 other parliamentarians were stripped of their immunity and being incarcerated. So we've seen this in the last 3 years, this attack against HDP. So given that, I do not see, I guess, a quick political solution or regaining the trust of the Kurdish population within Turkey itself. I think there's a lot of suspicion that is towards Erdoğan amongst, I guess, the Kurds that have voted for HDP, given that, the removal of mayors, the recent removal of mayors and so forth, and placing in those municipalities government-appointed trustees and so forth has, obviously fomented a lot of distrust towards the government that they will do anything right by the Kurdish community.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying we can't say what's going to happen in the future, but right now,
in the very
hopes are essentially nil.
Well, I won't say nil in that sense, but I think there is a lot of massive disgruntled, and there's their votes, given that they're very much their pivotal or key democratic right, which is the vote itself, and a number of their mayors, especially after the local elections, who some of them got up by nearly 60-70% of the votes, have been removed overnight. Not pending any legal process, just based upon what the government says is they've got connections to PKK and so forth, and sort of arbitrarily removing them, appointing government trusted administrators. So yeah, I definitely don't see a quick solution to the Turkish Kurdish issue, in the near future. Going forward, a year or two, I'm not sure, but at this point in time, no.
Okay. Speaking of political campaigns, pro-government newspaper Yeni Shafak said on its front page yesterday, on Tuesday, that a vote by the Turkish Council of State to allow for the conversion of a former Greek church in Istanbul back into a mosque could be used to convert the iconic 1,600-year-old Hagia Sophia into a mosque. This is an idea Erdoğan and the AKP and pro-government outlets seem to trot out regularly. Could you see it really happening this time?
I'm not sure. This is something goes back to not just Erdoğan. This goes back to Milli Görüş movement, so which Erdoğan stems from. So before the AKP, the party that's Erdoğan's party. So Saadet Partisi and so forth, and its various reincarnations. Especially Saadet Partisi when it was in that I guess a very that the coalition with Çiller in '96, and then it was brought down in '97 by the soft coup. Leading up to that, there was always these calls that to turn the Hagia Sophia to a mosque. So this sort of follows in that line. But I think it's much more of a populist sentiment rather than something that Erdoğan will actually go ahead and do itself. I think we see Erdoğan says a lot of things, and that to get a reaction from his base, very much shaped by populist rhetoric. So I don't think it would really go ahead. I can't see it going ahead in the future, but it is something, these things that he does go back to sort of stir the pot a little bit and rile up his sort of his troops on the ground, really.
It seems like it might also be kind of Erdogan and the AKP maybe signaling they're still have some control over Istanbul, because there's this draft law recently prepared by the AKP government, the federal government, that aims to hand authority over all variety of development near the Bosporus Strait to a new national body, taking it away from Istanbul municipality. This past Sunday, opposition mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu vowed that authority over the Bosporus and surrounding areas belongs only to Istanbul. How do you see this kind of emerging rivalry for Istanbul playing out?
Look, I think given that the government, the presidency pretty much controls, given the constitutional referendum in 2017, all pretty much the levers of the state and government under control of the president, which is Erdogan at this point in time. And in the first 12 months, just to give you some statistics, in the first 12 months, 77% of all laws were made through presidential decree. So no democratic process, no inclusivity. So they were just basically arbitrarily made. Given that, I can definitely continue to see that Erdogan would look to wither away the power of the municipal mayors in Turkey, especially Istanbul itself, that it is a vast patronage network for the AKP itself. So an economic bloodline, really, massive economic pipeline for the AKP. So these overnight sort of decisions, which become law, I can definitely see continue to erode the powers of someone like Ekrem İmamoğlu.
Is there much he can do? Is there much he can do to battle it?
I'm not sure. I mean, he's continuing saying that he will go to a court and so forth. But when these become through decree law, then it is really, really hard to sort of stave these off. So I'm not sure legally how much weight that İmamoğlu has to stop this onslaught. The only way he can do it is through popular vote and through the electorate. So, and given that the next round of elections is in 3-4 years' time, that's a long time to wait.
Right. This isn't the first time İmamoğlu and Erdogan have clashed publicly, and many have
not at all.
Many have pegged him, Istanbul's new mayor, as a rival for Erdogan.
Of course, yes.
But as you say, no election is scheduled until late 2023, I think it is.
Yeah.
So many people are expecting that there will be an early vote. Would you agree? Are these two potential rivals for the presidency, and are these kind of Istanbul disputes actually more about the national political stage?
Look, I think it's this battle between İmamoğlu and Erdogan. I mean, İmamoğlu is still a municipal mayor. Who knows what the future is going to hold? His party leader is Kılıçdaroğlu, who has a very firm grip on the party. He's lost numerous elections and he's still refused to give up power. And he's surrounded himself in the party hierarchy with loyalists. So I mean, this is something normal in Turkish party political culture. So at this point in time, yes, I mean that is the narrative around İmamoğlu, that there's a parallel between Erdogan's rise to political power and so forth. But there's a long way to go for İmamoğlu to be able to challenge Erdogan, given that Erdogan has vast control of the political landscape. So whether he'll allow that or not, I can pretty much would say that put my money on that Erdogan would not allow the rise of someone like İmamoğlu to come about to challenge him, given that he has a very popular appeal in Istanbul, which can easily translate or transcend to Turkey more broadly. Sorry, I forgot. What was the other part of the question?
That's okay. That's good. I mean, you speak from a position of authority on this, as you're currently working on a book about opposition parties under authoritarian regimes in Turkey. Could you just give us a sense of how your research of earlier political eras informs your view of what's happening today between Erdogan and İmamoğlu, between AKP and the CHP, maybe even the HDP?
Yeah, of course. So I guess my current research is looking at the opposition parties in Turkey at this point in time and how they've sort of reacted to this change into an authoritarian system and the strategies to go about by that they sort of somehow keeping this multi-party culture alive. But the manuscript I've just handed in is based on my thesis, which looks at leadership culture in Turkey, and pretty much unpicks or fleshes out this a very prominent, salient pattern of authoritarianism, and that has been prevalent throughout Turkey's democratic political era. So when we look at someone like Adnan Menderes, Celal Bayar, Demirel, Bülent Ecevit in the 70s, Turgut Özal, Tansu Çiller and so forth, Necmettin Erbakan, Mesut Yılmaz, and to Erdogan himself. So Erdogan is highly authoritarian, and this is a very known fact, but what my argument is that this is nothing unique in Turkey's political history, that Turkey's always had these strong man authoritarian leaders who have ruled their parties.
But to this extent?
No, not to this extent. There was always what's the real difference is between Erdogan and the other eras is that the military has been defanged, whereas the military throughout these eras, as we know, throughout 60, 71, 1980, and the so-called 1997, has been pretty much the stopgap for, I guess, this full transition to authoritarianism or a highly illiberal system, even though ironically, in doing that, it was very authoritarian or liberal itself. So, in terms of
right, the military has been defanged, but isn't there also, would you say, or maybe you disagree, isn't there also less true quality political opposition in this era?
No, I don't buy into that at all. I think.
I mean, you just pointed out how poor Kılıçdaroğlu has done.
Well, of course, but this is not to say that this hasn't occurred in Turkey's political history either. That, we had the first democratic era went for 10 years under the Democrat Party. So Adnan Menderes, who was prime minister for 10 years, and he was highly dictatorial and despotic by the end of the 1950s. Hence one of the reasons the coup and the military officers gave a reason for intervening. And he, against him had this Turkey's second president, which was İsmet İnönü, who was the leader of the CHP at that point in time. So I think it's not as easy as saying that Turkey at this point in time has weak political leaders, opposition leaders. I just think that the overwhelming part of power is in the hands of Erdogan, and there's really nothing that the opposition party can do in terms of to be able to. They don't have enough strategies to be able to fight back or to use other avenues.
Speaking of that, Kılıçdaroğlu came out yesterday with detailed criticism of the AKP Syria policy, highlighting 7 errors, including enabling the passage of foreign fighters through Turkey to join ISIS and the current offensive Operation Peace Spring. Do you see opposition politicians becoming more willing to be critical of Erdogan and the AKP in Syria, now that it seems to be helping him so much politically?
No, I think that they've been critical from the very beginning. When you look at Kılıçdaroğlu and so forth, this is nothing new. The criticism of Erdogan has always existed, and they've always been very critical and very and has a lot of merit in their criticism. I mean, Meral Akşener and so forth, and the HDP Selahattin Demirtas. It's just given that everything Erdogan's strong, like his executive power, the control of the judiciary, and so forth, that there are little in terms, and also the monopoly of the media is in the hands of the AKP itself. So it's really hard for these opposition leaders to have themselves heard or have these criticism heard, given the media will not able to. Most media outlets wouldn't be able to sort of broadcast their criticism. That it is very, as we all know, it's very pro-AKP. So if you can't get your message out to the electorate, to the citizenship, and you're always given basically a one-view narrative, which is pro-government, then it's really, really hard for criticism to be heard across the country.
Right. You mentioned earlier.
I think this is a very important factor that, if 90% of the TV stations, are peddling a pro-government line and not really giving any time to opposition voices, then it's very hard for the community, the Turkish communities or societies, to be aware of the failings of the government.
Right. You mentioned earlier former economic czar Ali Babacan and former PM Ahmet Davutoğlu, both of whom are expected to launch new political parties soon, and both of whom recently broke away from the AKP. I haven't heard a word from them in, I don't know, the past month possibly. It almost seems like, this Syria offensive is so dominating the political conversation, chasing away challengers, in addition to the media issues you mentioned. Have you heard anything about these Babacan and Davutoglu parties of late, and what might we expect of them?
No, of course not. I think they really put them onto the back foot, given this offensive into northern Syria. And I think this is where I think they might be biding their time. But last couple of days or so, that I heard that November is going to be a month for a lot of, I guess, rumors that these two parties might be about to sort of create or formally establish themselves or announce themselves onto the political scene in November sometime. So they're the rumors going around, but you are completely right. In the last month, that you've heard really rarely any news about these two upcoming parties or so-called rumored parties from Babacan and Davutoglu. So I think it has really caught them. I mean, it's given the offensive to Erdoğan, and put these so-called these rumored new two parties on the back foot and really biding their time until this wave of popularity or things stabilize a little bit more, where they can find themselves, be able to capture the audience and the attention again.
Mm-hmm. In a recent podcast about the Gulen movement, you said the movement's future is imperiled, not just because of Turkey's domestic and global crackdown on the group, which it blames for the July 2016 attempted coup, but also because the Turkish groups of this nature tend to revolve around the lead personality. And in this case, Gulen, is in frail health and perhaps doesn't seem to have long to live. So do you see the movement itself dying out in the next few years? It still has a significant global presence. Do you see it dying out soon?
No, I mean, I guess dying out, I wouldn't call it dying out, but definitely if Fethullah Gulen was to pass away, given that, given the whole, the organization is named after him and his teachings on his stream, I guess, on Islam, it is very much a cult of personality there that's built around him.
To them, it's not named after him. To them, it's called Hizmet, right?
Hizmet movement, definitely. I mean, this is, but that's the official. But given the power of his teachings and him himself, and how revered he is by all his followers, if he was to pass away, then I can definitely say that it would not be able to capture the same level of popularity, and somehow, and you might actually say, given its vast economic power and value, that you might even find a contest for the leadership. I mean, wealth or economic, I guess, financial gain does a lot of crazy things to people. Even the pious humans aren't bereft of materialism or material, I guess, yearnings, as we could say. But I do think that you will get, I guess, a very much a contest for their leadership, given that there are people, few people within the hierarchy high up, and you might find that there might be differing opinions on which way the movement should go amongst themselves as well. So there are numerous factors at play that would come about if Gulen was to pass away, or when he passed away. So, but given that, I do not think that it would actually be a very I guess the level of popularity and so forth that it would still exist, and his teachings would still exist, like Sayyid Nursi, but it would actually maybe fracture off into other movements amongst themselves.
Yeah, well, this perspective about dominant groups relying on a charismatic leader suggests the AKP is probably reliant on the continued presence of Erdoğan. As I said at the outset, he's seen a recent uptick in his popularity after many said that the AKP's lost İmamoğlu in the Istanbul rerun in June may have meant the beginning of the end for Erdoğan. What's your view? Do you expect him to stick around for many more years, or is Tayyip on the way out?
No, I expect him to stick around for many, many years. Not many, I'm not sure, but obviously for the near future, I definitely don't see Erdogan going anyway, voluntarily, especially, or electorally. And like I said, as we mentioned before, given that the next round of elections are slated for in a few years' time, I do not expect Erdogan to sort of to do anything that would sort of jeopardize his position. And again, he will do all that he can to make sure that his popularity stays at a peak. So it gets 50, 51, 52% of the population. So no, I don't see him going away anywhere voluntarily or electorally anytime soon.
You don't see any chance of him, sorry, you don't see any chance of him like calling for early elections, because he's so confident?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, look, that could definitely happen given that he is riding a massive wave of popularity since this military incursion into northern Syria. Definitely, I don't discount that at all. But that would just mean that he would win again, and which would extend his time as a president for much longer. Definitely.
I see. You think if he does do that, he's pretty much assured a victory?
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, I can't see. Well, look, anything can happen if he was to call it. But if it was, I guess he might actually call an election before the two I guess, rumored parties by Babacan and Davutoglu are actually created or established or given enough time to establish themselves within the electorate. And he might sort of try to catch them on the back foot and call it an election and sort of take advantage of his popularity at this point in time. Anything can happen, but do I see him going away easily or voluntarily? Not at all. I think Erdogan is he's a very smart politician, and hence why he's been able to stay at the very top of the political pyramid for so many years. And he's done extremely well to be able to do that, stave off challenges within the party and also within, I guess, the broadly multi-party arena itself. And even, judicially as well, remember the corruption allegations of 2013 and so forth. So he's been able to avoid, a lot of challenges.
Okay, I'll leave you with this one. The Turkish and U.S. presidents are set to meet next week in D.C., and Erdogan is said to be considering canceling his trip, presumably out of concerns about nationalist voters in the wake of U.S. sanctions and the U.S. House approving this Armenian genocide bill. How do you think Erdogan's base and Turkish voters more broadly view Erdogan's relationship with Trump and with the U.S.? Do they generally see him as strong? Most analysts seem to agree that he's been able to push Trump toward his views.
Well, that's, I guess, people that look at foreign policy or Turkey's foreign policy or Turkey-US relations, there is that narrative happening in the media that, Erdogan has somehow manipulated Trump to get his way and so forth. Look, I'm not privy to what happens behind closed doors, but it seems like Erdogan has gotten a few concessions out of Trump. And the only thing that's been an obstacle to that relationship or to Erdogan has been the Congress and these sort of acts or bills that they passed. So the genocide and recognizing genocide and so forth. But it seems like, there is some sort of relationship understanding between the two, and Trump is willing to, adhere to Erdogan's wishes. That's, I guess I can only speak on what is happening on the surface level. In terms of how, I guess, Erdogan's voter base or the AKP's voter base in Turkey views Erdogan's position vis-a-vis Trump in the US, I think they see it coming from a position of strength, and they adore him for it, for pushing President Trump to make more Turkey favorable concessions or decisions and so forth. So definitely, I think his voter base is really, really enjoying this point in time in terms of Turkey's foreign policy and US's sort of concessions towards Turkey and pulling out of northern Syria and so forth. It definitely is seen as a massive victory for Erdogan. And this whole thing of being a global leader, this really feeds into that. This really justifies why his support base would see him as being one of these global leaders that is being listened to and push his weight around, and when he says something, it gets done and so forth. So definitely, it really would be galvanizing his supporter base to believing that, or continue to believe that.
You paint a pretty dark picture of this authoritarian leader in power without much chance for the opposition parties.
I guess formally, when we look at this, I guess no one can really deny that Turkey is now transitioned to some form of authoritarian system. Some call it comparative authoritarians and so forth. But it definitely is not a liberal democracy by far. And, there is a semblance of democratic institutions, but these are on the surface. And when we look at scratch beneath the surface, we can see that, they don't have any really checks on Erdogan's power. And so when we can sort of evaluate in that sense, we can see that democracy is basically, I guess, in theory or in name only in Turkey. So there are elections, but we know how free and fair have the elections have been. If we look at the municipal elections at this point in time, we see that what's happening out in southeast and east of the country to the HDP municipalities and so forth, and the rerunning of voiding of the Istanbul elections and stuff like that really shows us that it's not a democratic system.
I guess
what the opposition have been doing is that they have been very good at their strategy. When we see, I guess, İmamoğlu's strategy and Mansur Yavaş's strategy in Ankara, so Mansur Yavaş who beat Melik Gökçek in Ankara on behalf of, I guess, for CHP, the candidate for CHP. We see that, there, especially İmamoğlu, is a different type of candidate that CHP has put up, and also offers a complete contrast to I guess, Erdogan's character and political strategy, which is much more, I guess, hostile and nasty strategy, whereas İmamoğlu is much more inclusive and so forth, and try to appeal to cross-section of Turks. And it seemed to work positively, but also he had the economic downturn in favor as well. So there are things that sort of aligned for the opposition candidates to win these major municipalities. I mean, you've also got Meral Akşener and CHP and Saadet Partisi consistently attacking the legitimacy of this new presidential system and really calling for a revert back to a parliamentarian system every chance that they get. So you've got these sort of attacks towards the legitimacy of the system and so forth. These new sort of characters, I guess, political characters as İmamoğlu and Mansur Yavaş, who aren't sort of these guys that will bang their fist up against the wall and yell and scream, but seem to be much more inclusive and soft-spoken.
And
seem to come from a more democratic culture.
I guess my understanding of what you've been saying is that while this system under Erdogan right now, tending towards authoritarianism, isn't unprecedented in Turkey for opposition parties to be doing so poorly for an extended period of time. But since the military is defanged and since Erdogan has been able to institute this new presidential system, it seems you're saying that opposition parties today, as compared to previous eras, have less chance of, let's say, turning the tide. Is that accurate?
Of course. I mean, when we look at the last couple of elections, not just municipal elections, but, let's look at the referendum in 2017 and that was done in a state of emergency. How free and fair and how open were the opposition parties able to campaign to oppose this change in political system? Not much.
That hasn't been the case in the past?
Not in that sense, because you haven't had a leader that has been able to. Actually, no. 1950s under Menderes. I'm sorry, I'll take that back. But during the 1950s under Menderes, the Democratic Party government of it was Adnan Menderes who was the prime minister, and Celal Bayar who was the president. But he also came from the Democrat Party as well. So these two men really worked in tandem to rule with a strong fist throughout the 1950s, and to a point that pretty much all political campaigns or public campaigns were, I guess, legally restricted throughout in the late 1950s. Journalists were thrown in jail and so forth. And so there is a parallel between 1950 and today's rule with Erdogan. So yes, there is precedence, but when we look at Turgut Özal used the, I guess, 1980 military constitution and the straitjacket, the very illiberal political sort of the constitution engineering by the military of the junta of 1980. He really used that for his own advantage and so forth. So I guess, yes, Erdogan is the most extreme example, but throughout Turkey's multi-party history, we do see precedents of what's happening now. But Erdogan is pretty much the only leader who's been able to amass so much political power in his hands and wield it freely and unchecked. So that's the difference. That's what I'm trying to get at. But definitely there's massive parallels between the 1950s and the Democrat Party and today's AKP.
Okay. Tezcan Gümüş, thanks so much for joining us. It was a pleasure.
So, thank you very much, David. Hopefully I made sense. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
I think you definitely did. Yeah. Thanks again.
Thank you. Speak to you soon. Have a good day.
You too.